My parents refused to watch my twins while I was having emergency surgery, saying it was an inconvenience and a burden since they had tickets to see Elton John with my sister. So, I called a babysitter from my hospital bed, cut all family ties, and ended my financial support to them. 2 weeks later, I heard a knock. "Don't you dare ask us to cancel our plans again. We've had these Elton John tickets for months," yelled my mother, her voice echoing in my hospital room. I sat there stunned, gripping my phone with trembling hands. It was Christmas Eve at the Las Vegas Medical Center. Just me, my 2-year-old twins, Ethan and Emily playing quietly in a corner, and a nurse named Valerie checking my vitals. The pain in my abdomen was excruciating, like someone was twisting a nerve, a knife inside me. But the indifferent look on my mother's face through the video call hurt even more. "My name is Natasha Wilson. I'm 33, and for as long as I can remember, I've been last in my own family. My younger sister, Jessica, the golden child, could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. Meanwhile, I couldn't even get them to watch their only grandchildren while I underwent emergency surgery for complications related to my pregnancy. Doctors had detected internal bleeding that required immediate attention. But all my parents cared about were their concert tickets and celebrating Christmas Eve with Jessica. When I finally asked them for help, after exhausting all other options, my father's response wounded me more than any surgical tool. "You're becoming a real nuisance and a burden, Natasha. We're retired. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems." I'd been financially supporting my parents since they took early retirement 3 years ago. Every month, without fail, I sent them $500 to help with their mortgage and expenses, even after James died. I did it out of love and duty, believing that family should support each other. How foolish I was. As my tears fell silently onto the hospital blanket, Valerie gently squeezed my shoulder. "My friend Olivia is a professional nanny who specializes in childhood trauma. Let me call her," she offered. Her kindness stood in stark contrast to my parents' callousness. The twins were too young to understand what was happening. They'd already lost their father in a car accident. Now they could lose me too if the surgery went wrong. The thought terrified me, but not as much as leaving them with people who saw them as a burden. In that moment, with pain ripping through my body and disappointment crushing my heart, I made a decision. "Yes, please call her," I told Valerie. And with those words, I began to sever the toxic ties with the people who had raised me but never truly loved me. When I hung up the phone, a wave of memories washed over me. My childhood was filled with moments of being overlooked while Jessica received all the attention. When I graduated from college with honors, my parents barely acknowledged it because Jessica had been chosen for a local commercial that same weekend. When I married James, they complained that the wedding venue was too far from their house. Even when the twins were born, they visited only once, claiming babies were too messy for their liking. James had been my rock through it all. He understood the pain of familial disappointment, having been estranged from his own father for years. "We'll build our own family," he'd say, "one that knows how to love." And we did, creating a warm home filled with laughter and acceptance. But 6 months ago, a drunk driver took him away, leaving me alone to raise our children while battling depression and grief. Despite my loss, I continued to support my parents. I even increased the monthly amount when they mentioned they were struggling with inflation. I wanted to be better than them, to prove that families should support each other, no matter what. The irony was crushing. There I was, bleeding internally, possibly dying, and they couldn't miss a concert to care for my children. Valerie returned with the news that her friend Olivia would arrive in an hour. "She's incredible with kids," Valerie assured me. She used to work with trauma victims at the Children's Hospital before becoming a private nanny. "How much will this cost?" I asked, worry creeping into my voice. Medical bills were already piling up, as James's insurance coverage had limitations. "Don't worry about that now," Valerie said. "Let's focus on getting you ready for surgery." But I was worried. I thought about the $500 I was scheduled to transfer to my parents next week, money that could now help pay for childcare. That thought sparked something within me, a flame of self-preservation that had been extinguished years ago. When Olivia arrived, she was everything Valerie had promised: kind, professional, and connected with the twins immediately. As the hospital staff prepared me for surgery, I made a decision. "Could you bring me my phone one more time?" I asked Valerie. With trembling hands, I sent 2 messages. The first was to my bank, canceling all future automatic transfers to my parents. The second was to my parents. I will no longer be providing you with financial support. My children and I deserve better than to be your afterthought. Do not contact me again. As they wheeled me towards the operating room, I felt something unexpected through the pain and fear. Freedom. The surgery was a success but left me weaker than anticipated. I spent 5 days in the hospital recovering and regaining consciousness, grateful for Olivia, who had gone above and beyond to stay with the twins in my hospital room during the day and take them to my apartment at night. During one of my more lucid moments, I noticed my phone blinking with notifications. 27 missed calls and numerous text messages from my parents and Jessica. Most of the messages followed a predictable pattern. Confusion, then anger, then desperate pleas about their mortgage payment. Not once did they ask how the surgery went or if the twins were okay. My father's final message was especially telling. You can't just do this to us. We have a cruise plan next month, and the tickets are non-refundable. My sister's messages were different. She seemed genuinely confused. Mom and Dad just told me you were having a minor procedure. What's going on? Why are they so freaked out about money? I realized my parents had lied to Jessica about the severity of my situation to justify choosing the concert over their grandchildren. I decided to tell her the truth, texting her the whole story while still groggy from medication. Her reply came quickly. Oh my God, Natasha. I had no idea it was emergency surgery. They told me you were being dramatic about a routine checkup. If I had known, I would have watched the twins. I'm so sorry. I believed Jessica. She wasn't cruel. She had simply been raised in an environment where she was taught that her needs came first. Perhaps this revelation would help her see our parents for who they truly were. By the time I was discharged, I had made several decisions. First, I hired Olivia part-time to help with the twins during my recovery. Second, I contacted a lawyer to draft a will designating a trusted friend as guardian of the twins in case anything happened to me. Certainly not my parents. Third, I blocked my parents' numbers and allowed Jessica limited contact while I assessed her sincerity. The financial consequences of my decision were significant. The $500 monthly payment to my parents represented almost a third of my income as a graphic designer. Without that burden, I could afford proper childcare and maybe even start rebuilding the emergency fund that had been depleted after James's death. That night, as I lay in my own bed with the twins sleeping in their room across the hall, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was guilt, the ingrained feeling that I was somehow wrong to put myself and my children first. There was fear of managing recovery while caring for 2 toddlers. But there was also an unfamiliar sensation of self-respect that was taking root. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. Just had a huge fight with Mom and Dad about how they treated you. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Can we talk tomorrow? Maybe I wasn't completely alone after all. 2 weeks after my surgery, I was slowly regaining my strength. The incision site still ached when I moved too quickly, but each day brought improvement. Olivia had been a godsend, arriving every morning to help with the twins while I worked from home. My graphic design clients had been surprisingly understanding of my limited availability, and I was grateful for the remote work that allowed me to be near my children. Jessica had visited the house twice, bringing healthy meals and spending time with the twins. Our conversations were cautious at first, but over time, she opened up about her own experiences with our parents. They always made it seem like you were choosing to distance yourself from the family, she admitted one night, as we watched the twins play. I never realized they were pushing you away. I was beginning to see a new side to my sister, one that had been hidden under years of our parents' manipulation. While I wasn't ready to fully trust her yet, I appreciated her efforts. Then a knock at the door. Something I'd been dreading. Through the peephole, I saw my parents standing in the hallway. My mother nervously clutched her designer purse, while my father stood with arms crossed, the familiar impatience etched on his face. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before opening the door just enough to speak through the gap. What do you want? I asked, my voice firmer than I'd expected. Natasha dear, we've been so worried. My mother began, her saccharine tone immediately raising my defenses. You haven't been answering our calls, and we needed to make sure you and the twins were okay. We're fine, I responded flatly. Now if that's all, it's not all, my father interrupted, pushing the door open slightly. We need to discuss this ridiculous financial situation. The bank called us about our mortgage payment, and we had to dip into our cruise savings to cover it. The audacity was breathtaking. No questions about my recovery, no concern for their grandchildren, just financial demands. I told you I was cutting ties financially. I meant it. But darling, my mother pleaded, her voice rising in pitch, we've come to rely on that money. Your father and I adjusted our lifestyle based on your commitment to help us. My commitment? I repeated incredulously. I've been sending money out of guilt and obligation, while you couldn't even watch your grandchildren during my emergency surgery. My father's face darkened. That's not fair, Natasha. We had plans. Important plans. More important than my children's safety? More important than my life. I responded angrily. You know what the doctor said? There was a chance I wouldn't survive that surgery. Did you even bother to ask? Their silence was answer enough. We made a mistake, my mother whispered dramatically. Are you really going to punish us like this? This isn't punishment, Mom. It's a consequence, I said, feeling a strange calmness wash over me. I've spent my entire life seeking your approval and support, and in my moment of greatest need, you chose Elton John tickets over helping me. Over your own grandchildren. Use some respect, my father interjected, switching to his tone of demanding respect. I'm a father too. If I were to replicate how you have treated me, I would never treat Ethan and Emily, I replied. Just then Emily appeared suddenly, clutching her stuffed giraffe. My mother switched tactics instantly. There's my precious grandbaby, she cooed, leaning down. Emily, unfamiliar with these strangers, recoiled and looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes. I think you should go, I said quietly. When I'm ready to talk, if I'm ever ready, I'll contact you. But the money, my father began. It's no longer your concern, I finished, gently closing the door. The following morning my parents returned with reinforcements. My Aunt Patty, my mother's sister, who'd always positioned herself as the family peacemaker. Natasha, honey, let's be reasonable, Aunt Patty pleaded from outside my door, which I hadn't opened. Your parents are struggling. Without your help. They managed their finances for decades before I started helping them, I responded from behind the door. They chose to retire early, knowing their savings weren't sufficient. My mother's voice cut in. We made those decisions because you promised to help us. We had to cancel our cruise, and now we could lose the house. Their attempts at manipulation were so transparent now that I had stepped out of the fog of guilt that had surrounded me for years. When I had promised them support, I had offered to help temporarily after their retirement. But somehow that had morphed into a permanent, expected arrangement. Mom, Dad, I'm recovering from major surgery, and I'm caring for 2 toddlers. This conversation is over, I said firmly before walking away from the door, ignoring their continued knocking and pleas. Later that day, I received a group email from my father, addressed to the entire extended family, detailing how I had abandoned them in their time of need after they had sacrificed everything for me. The email conveniently omitted their refusal to help with the twins during my emergency surgery, and instead painted me as an ungrateful daughter who had suddenly cut them off for no reason. What they hadn't anticipated was the backlash. My cousin Michael, who lived near my parents, replied to the group. Uncle Robert, didn't you buy a new boat last month? Aunt Diana, wasn't that a new diamond bracelet you were showing off at Thanksgiving? Other family members chimed in, with many privately messaging me to ask for my side of the story. Even Aunt Patty called me directly after learning the truth. I had no idea about your surgery, she admitted. They told me you were just being dramatic about a routine procedure and using it to punish them financially. Meanwhile, Jessica sided fully with me after witnessing our parents' behavior firsthand. She helped me craft a factual response to the family email thread, simply stating, I recently underwent emergency surgery with a significant risk of complications. My parents refused to watch my children during that time because they had concert tickets. I am now focusing on my recovery and caring for my twins without additional stress. The support I received afterward was overwhelming. Cousin Michael's wife brought over homemade meals. A second cousin I barely knew offered her babysitting services part-time free of charge. Jessica started spending weekends at my apartment, getting to know her niece and nephew while helping me recover. Most surprisingly, Valerie from the hospital connected me with a support group for young widowed parents. Their first meeting was via Zoom so I could participate from home, and for the first time since James died, I felt truly understood by people who had walked my path. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation deteriorated rapidly. They had, in fact, been living beyond their means, counting on my monthly contributions to maintain their lifestyle of travel and luxury purchases. Jessica discovered they had taken out a second mortgage on their house a year ago to buy their boat, assuming I would continue subsidizing their primary mortgage indefinitely. "They've been lying to everyone," Jessica said, stunned after helping them review their finances at their request. "They're not destitute. They just overspend. They'd be fine if they sold the boat and the vacation timeshare." Their increasingly desperate voicemails and text messages continued, but with each passing day, their hold on me weakened. I was building something new from the ashes of their betrayal, an authentic support network based on mutual care rather than obligation. A month after my surgery, an unexpected twist occurred. My parents received a foreclosure notice. Jessica called me to inform me, with a mix of worry and exasperation in her voice. "They're in a complete panic," she explained. "The bank is giving them 60 days to catch up on payments or they lose the house." "What about their retirement funds?" I asked, bouncing Emily on my knee as Ethan napped. "Pretty much depleted. They spent a chunk on that boat, and then they invested the rest in some scheme Dad's golf buddy recommended. They lost almost everything," she sighed. "I'm not saying you should help them, Natasha. I just thought you should know." Later that night, I received desperate text messages from my parents, who had now abandoned all pretense of concern for my well-being and were openly begging for money. My mother's message was particularly revealing. "We never thought you would really stop sending us money. We assumed you were just angry and would start sending it again after a week or two." Their assumption that my boundaries weren't real infuriated me. In all those years of putting their needs ahead of my own and accepting their mistreatment, they had never truly respected me at all. Meanwhile, my own life was transforming in unexpected ways. The support group had become a lifeline, connecting me with other young widows and widowers who understood the unique challenges of grief and single parenthood. Through them, I met Diana, a real estate agent whose husband had died of cancer 2 years prior, leaving her with a 3-year-old son. She helped me consider options I hadn't thought possible, like selling my 2 small rental properties and using the equity to move to a more affordable neighborhood with better childcare options. I had also started a small side business designing memorial websites, inspired by the one I had created for James. Several members of my support group had commissioned websites and word was spreading. For the first time since being widowed, I felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The contrast between my growth and my parents' collapse became even more stark when they showed up unannounced at my apartment, this time with a detailed spreadsheet of their debts. "We need $14,000 to catch up on the mortgage and avoid foreclosure," my father explained, his usual authoritative tone now tinged with desperation. I invited them in, not out of obligation but because I was curious to hear their rationale now that they were truly facing the consequences. "What about selling the boat?" I asked, gesturing for them to sit at my small dining table. "We'd take a loss," my father protested. "And the timeshare?" "We've tried, but the market is terrible," my mother added quickly. "Besides, those are our retirement luxuries." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Luxuries they couldn't afford. "We could afford them with your help," my father retorted, his tone hardening. "It's the least you can do after all we've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me?" I asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. The twins chose that moment to wander into the room, Ethan clutching his favorite toy truck and Emily babbling cheerfully. My parents' expressions softened instantly. "There are our precious babies," my mother cooed, reaching for Emily, who promptly hid behind my legs. "They don't know you," I stated simply. "You've seen them 3 times in their lives? You chose not to be involved." "That's not true," my father protested. "We're busy people. Too busy for your only grandchildren. Too busy to help your daughter through emergency surgery." But not too busy to ask for money, I observed. I think that says everything about your priorities. My mother's face crumpled. I could no longer tell if it was genuine emotion or calculated manipulation. Without your help, we'll lose everything, she whispered. I lost my husband, I replied, my voice steady. My children lost their father. We survived. You will too. 3 months after my surgery, my parents faced the inevitable. They were forced to sell their house to avoid foreclosure. Jessica kept me informed of their situation, though I maintained my distance. They had managed to find a modest condo that was considerably smaller than their 4,000 square foot lakefront property. My father had reluctantly sold his boat at a loss, and the timeshare had finally been unloaded for a fraction of what they'd paid. They're actually blaming you for their financial problems, telling everyone, Jessica told me during one of her weekly visits. They're telling anyone who will listen that you abandoned them after promising them lifelong support. Let them talk, I responded, feeling surprisingly unfazed. The truth speaks for itself. And it did. My extended family had largely rallied around me after learning the full story. Even my father's sister, who had always sided with him in family disputes, called to express her support after learning they had refused to help me during my surgery. Meanwhile, my own situation had drastically improved. Diana from my support group had helped me find and purchase a small 3-bedroom house in a family-friendly neighborhood. The mortgage payments were actually less than my apartment rent, and the twins had a backyard to play in for the first time in their lives. My memorial website design side business had grown enough that I could reduce my graphic design clients and focus on work that felt meaningful. Olivia still helped with childcare 3 days a week, but I had adjusted my schedule to maximize my time with Ethan and Emily. Most importantly, I had found community. Neighbors brought casseroles when we moved in. The support group organized playdates. Jessica had become a genuine sister, rather than a competitor for our parents' affection. Even Valerie from the hospital would occasionally stop by with her kids. I had lost my husband and cut ties with my parents, but somehow I felt less alone than ever before. 6 months after my surgery, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. I almost tossed it in the trash unopened, but curiosity won. Inside, there was something I had never seen before: vulnerability. I've had time to reflect on my behavior, she wrote. Watching you build a life without our help has forced me to face some painful truths about myself as a mother. I was jealous of your independence, your resilience. It bothered me that you didn't seem to need me the way I needed my mother. But I see now that you did need me, just not in the way I wanted you to need me. When you asked us to watch the twins during your surgery, you were reaching out and we failed you completely. I am so sorry. The letter went on to explain how they had completely restructured their finances. My father had taken a part-time job at a local hardware store. They had sold most of their luxury items and were living modestly for the first time in decades. She didn't ask for money or forgiveness, just acknowledgement of her apology. I showed the letter to Jessica, who was skeptical. They've been talking about writing to you for weeks. Dad was resistant at first, but I think he's starting to see things differently too, especially after his heart scare last month. Heart scare? I asked, concerned despite myself. Just high blood pressure and chest pains, but it scared him. He's on medication now and following doctor's orders, Jessica explained. I think facing his mortality has made him a little more humble. I wasn't ready to respond to the letter immediately. I needed time to process my feelings. Was this genuine remorse or another manipulation tactic? Had they truly changed, or were they simply adapting their strategy? That night, I looked through old family photos for the first time since I had cut ties. Behind the smiling faces, I saw patterns I hadn't perceived before. My parents had always been actors, performing the role of perfect parents while catering to their own needs first. A year after my surgery, I finally agreed to meet with my parents at a neutral location, a quiet cafe near my new home. When they arrived, I barely recognized them. My father looked smaller than I remembered, his confident posture replaced by a more humble demeanor. My mother's designer clothes had been replaced by a simple, practical outfit. The twins were with Jessica for the afternoon. I still wasn't ready for a full family reunion. We sat in awkward silence until my father did something unprecedented. He cried. I've been a terrible father, he admitted, his voice cracking. and an even worse grandfather. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I see it now. How selfish we've been. My mother reached across the table, stopping short of touching me, but gesturing. We've been in family therapy for months, she explained. It was Jessica's idea, and we resisted at first. But it's been transformative. I didn't rush to forgive them or make promises I couldn't keep. Instead, I shared pictures of the twins and told them about our new life. They listened without interrupting, without making it about themselves, perhaps for the first time in their lives. As we parted, my father asked quietly, "Would it be possible someday to meet our grandchildren?" I considered carefully before responding. That depends on your actions, not your words. If you're truly committed to change, we can start with short, supervised visits. But understand this. My children will only have relationships with people who respect their mother. Leaving that meeting, I didn't feel the crushing weight of obligation, or the burning resentment that had defined our relationship for so long. Instead, I felt something new, the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her worth, who had set boundaries and would enforce them without apology. It remained to be seen whether my parents could truly change, but I had already transformed from a daughter desperate for approval into a mother fiercely protective of her children and her own well-being. The final act of our family drama was yet to be written, but for the first time I was holding the pen.